Good morning. My name is Judy Hazen, and I'm a member of the Chats Committee, Chats with Champions Committee here at Skidompha Library, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this morning. These chats are free to the public and are looked forward to eagerly, as many of you know. You will see them publicized in the Lincoln County News. The next chat on September 24th will feature Sharon Lovejoy, a recognized gardening expert and also author of adult and children's books. And we hope you will be joining us for this. Before introducing our author this morning, I'd like to thank Mel Gormley, our videographer, and I would like to ask you if you would kindly silence your cell phones so they do not disturb anybody during the talk this morning. Our speaker this morning, Kate Braestrup, is probably familiar to many of you. She lives in Maine with her husband and 6 children. Kate is a busy wife, mother, chaplain to the Maine Game Warden Service, and author of a novel titled Onion and several memoirs. Kate is here today to discuss her highly anticipated and well-received new book titled Anger and Flares, a memoir of motherhood, hope, and service. I'm sure you will be learning this morning how she deals with the complexities of parenthood and service. Her book will be on sale after her talk out in the lobby, and the sale and signing will be handled by Maine Bookstore. It's my pleasure now to welcome Kate Braestrup. Can I go? I was told I had to wait for it. So. What I thought I would do this morning is just read to you a little out of the book, and then I can take questions and we can have a discussion.
Could you talk a little loud?
Yes, speak
Is
up.
this not loud enough?
I'm not sure the mic is on.
Well, that would probably help. Yeah. I can talk loud too, but it's probably no, it
It's
isn't.
on. It's on.
All right, we'll try this again. Okay? But wave at me if I'm not. I don't want to mumble. When my children were very small and learning how to speak, there were glitches. Zach, for example, was very fond of lurgic. Forced to estimate, I would say Zach said lurgic for maybe 6 weeks until his ear and tongue aligned and he began asking for yogurt. His father and I, on the other hand, went on saying lurgic for years. We were charmed into it, the way we were charmed into repeating Peter's equally short-lived but adorable, "I love you, Mama." Surely we weren't the only parents to find our offspring's transient speech impediments irresistible and catchy. Nor could ours have been the only family in which the jargon of one member's occupation turned up in ordinary conversation. I bet the local pharmacist's family proclaims its affection in doses and warns one another of side effects. As PKs, or preacher's kids, my children grew accustomed to being greeted, soothed, and lambasted with biblical verses. And since I am also a law enforcement chaplain, and their dad was a state trooper, our family's slang is strongly tinged, too, with the language of police work. I can mostly keep myself from referring to our family car as a vehicle. And I've yet to answer the question, do you have children, with affirmative, 3 Caucasian males, 3 Caucasian females, last seen headed southbound. But I have been known to answer my husband Seam's suggestion that we meet up for lunch with a brisk 10-4, what's your 20? Like soldiers and truckers and anyone who communicates over occasionally untrustworthy radio waves, American police use numeric codes to replace or supplement the spoken word. The codes vary from place to place. 10-4 always and everywhere means affirmative, but in Maine the code for subject has mental health issues is 1044. 1088 if you're really. Officers with the LAPD, meanwhile, will describe that same person as 5150. Which I like. The last words I heard Drew utter, my husband Drew. I should explain I have 2 husbands. I have my first late husband, and I have my second right on time husband. You'll have to keep them straight, I guess. The last words I heard my first husband utter weren't actually words at all. It was early morning and he was leaving for work. His state police cruiser was still in the driveway, the driver's side door ajar, his German Shepherd canine Rock turning circles in the back seat, flattening the grass, settling in for a day on patrol. I was standing in the driveway in my bare feet, though it was April and the light snow had fallen the night before. The strong spring sunlight was already starting to melt the snow off the black asphalt, which was beginning to warm. 4:12 August on 10/8, Drew said to the dispatcher. Neither the dispatcher nor I needed to translate this remark into English. Trooper James Andrew Griffith is on duty and ready for service. The dispatcher answered 10-4, 412, and I mused affectionately to myself, what a cool job he's got. No wonder he loves it. As I went back into the house to finish getting ready for the day, though not for the day it would turn out to be. A little more than an hour later, the dispatcher was advising units statewide of a 1050 involving a state police cruiser and a box truck fully loaded with ice. She was calling for a 1057, and I heard the sirens and looked out the window in time to see the flashing red lights of the first ambulance racing down Route 1 on its way to the accident. For 11 years, I had been 10-8, 24/7 as Drew's A unit, the mother of our 4 little B units. And suddenly I was a state trooper's widow, which doesn't have its own code. Feeling called to explore new ways to understand and serve the human need he had encountered as a law enforcement officer, Drew had made plans to attend seminary and eventually to seek ordination as a minister. Without knowing it, he'd left a trail for me to follow toward my own service. Not one made of breadcrumbs, but of brochures and application forms for the Bangor Theological Seminary. A year and a half after his death, I entered and began work toward a master's degree in divinity. In just a moment, I'm going to turn that into wine. Meanwhile, finding itself in need of a chaplain, the Maine Warden Service asked Lieutenant Bill Allen to telephone that state trooper's widow, the one who, rumor had it, was going to seminary and becoming a minister. Bill has an appropriately deep Hebrew prophet-like voice. And though he probably asked in English if I wanted the job, I received and accepted my call to ministry in spiritual Creole. 10-4, God, 412A will be 10-8. Seam is an artist and a teacher, but when he married me, he married into the Maine law enforcement family and was even new baptized. As my spouse, he's 2107A. Along with adding 4 children to his life, he's had to adjust to such novelties as the occasional armed, uniformed person showing up to the house to be friendly or maybe to use the bathroom. His relationship to the world at large has changed subtly or not so subtly also. "Does your wife attend executions?" acquaintances ask upon hearing that he is married to the chaplain of the warden service. "She works with game wardens, not prison wardens." "So what does she do? Bless the moose?" "Well, I bless them whenever I get the chance, along with bears, deer, the occasional otter. Not that these four-legged denizens of the woods actually require, let alone request, my blessing. More often," Seam explains, "the chaplain's blessings are joined to the much more urgent practical assistance given by game wardens to the two-legged, wandering, accident-prone, and occasionally fratricidal species that makes up the citizenry of Maine and our seasonal visitors. I offer comfort and support to anxious families and friends of people who've met with an accident, gotten lost in the woods or drowned in a lake or a river. I provide pastoral care to the wardens themselves who are tasked with rescue missions, or when rescue is impossible, with recovering remains and managing heartbreak. In return for explaining the work and mission of Maine's game wardens to civilians, Seam gets a taste of the entertainment so reliably and generously offered by the public to off-duty law enforcement officers. He is given the dramatic details of the last speeding ticket his interlocutor received. Seam's children, Ilona and Cobus, have meanwhile learned to greet their stepmother at the door with a compassionate query, "Did they find the body?" With longevity comes the presumption of expertise, and I've been doing this work for quite a while now. And I am often invited to speak about death and its related issues, grief, trauma, the care and handling of bereaved persons around the country. On a flight to one such speaking engagement in Mobile, Alabama, I was seated beside a woman who noticed that I was knitting a baby booty. She struck up a conversation, and once the blessing of convicts versus the blessing of moose issue was out of the way, the woman began to tell me all about the father of her unborn and as yet unconceived child. This happens a lot, by the way, and not just to me. Clergy colleagues confirm that when a member of the traveling public finds out he or she is in the presence of a person of the cloth, they are moved to share their joys and deep concerns. A very old woman wonders whether she is morally obliged to tell her husband that one of their septuagenarian children isn't actually his. A muscular young European wonders aloud whether he might actually be a woman, and only then admits he's German. Once, when I happened to be going through security wearing a clerical collar, I had a TSA officer follow me all the way to the departure lounge so he could tell me about the love of his life. She was a prostitute. He had been a young grunt on R&R from Vietnam, and they had spent 4 magical days together in 1970 in a hotel room in Bangkok. It wasn't how it sounds, the TSA guy said mournfully, shaking his grizzled head. It was really special, and I never saw her again. My flight was called then, so all I could offer him was a prayer, a request for God's blessing for him and his erstwhile lover, to be borne aloft along with the white-knuckled entreaties I'd be mumbling as the jumbo jet hauled itself into the skies. The woman on the flight to Mobile was telling me about a man she'd never met. She felt as though she knew him. She was even, she said, at least a little smitten with him, though she was A, a lesbian, and B, old enough to be the guy's mother. Having read all about him in a catalog of donors sent to her by a sperm bank in California, she'd sent away at once for what she called his vials. Packed in dry ice, those were probably waiting at home now in her mailbox in Mobile. I said, wow. Southern accent aside, this woman was eerily like me. She had short graying hair and a Birkenstock and socks fashion sense. She was even, like me, a Unitarian Universalist, and though she wasn't a mother yet, she certainly wanted to be one, so we had that maternal instinct thing in common too. But while the genes and the timing for my children's births were pretty much chosen by the brainless force of your youthful passion, here was a mature woman making these choices as deliberately and consciously as modern science allows. Fascinated, I asked, "What do women look for in a sperm donor?" She chuckled. "I can't speak for all women, of course. Everyone's different." Well, actually, she could have spoken for all women, or at least for a substantial majority of the customers of American sperm banks. She, like most, chose a donor who was white, tall, physically fit, mentally healthy, and intelligent, by which is really meant has been to college. The sperm banks locate themselves near college campuses for a reason. Their donors are mostly cash-hungry college students, and this apparently suits everyone just fine. Though no one mentions it, college-educated is also a marker of social class. No one, however liberal, appears to be trolling inner cities and trailer parks for potential sperm donors. In fact, women pay a premium for the genetic contributions of students with degrees from Ivy League schools. I didn't raise this or any of the many thorny issues I might otherwise have been tempted to hash out with her, partly because it was going to be a long flight, but mostly because I am a middle-aged, Birkenstock and socks liberal, and we don't judge. Though I couldn't resist remarking that her donor sounded as much like George W. Bush as like Bill Clinton. After meeting that mother-to-be on the plane to Mobile, I passed an idle afternoon online delving into the commerce of reproductive material. And for this, I was punished in the all too familiar way. I am and shall be in perpetuity subject to frequent email solicitations from several Californian sperm banks. They offer me vials from their most exciting new donors in blurbs that could have been cribbed directly from Match.com, except that unlike single men looking for a date and possible LTR, sperm donors do not admit to human weakness. "Call me Mr. Charming," invited a recent sample. 5'11", Caucasian, German/Irish/English, hazel eyes, athletic build with a great smile, Virgo, loves animals. This pretty much described Drew. With just a few tweaks, Dutch, blue-green eyes, it could describe Seam as well. Obviously, I have a type. Back when I was first dating Drew and beginning to meet his family, I noticed, however, that he didn't look all that much like his parents or his siblings. I don't mean there wasn't a family resemblance. I suspected no secret adoption or hidden extramarital paternity. Drew just looked different. So then one day I was browsing through family photo albums, and there, gazing calmly out of a sepia-tinted 1920s studio portrait, were Drew's eyes. There was his mouth and the shape of his chin. It was a photograph of Drew's great-great-uncle Lacey, whose traits had evidently jumped 2 generations. So while the implication of the sperm bank's listing clearly is that would-be customers are to imagine themselves giving birth to a smiling, hazel-eyed, athletic animal lover, the kid could just as easily turn out to be a shy, gray-eyed cat hater, like the donor's Aunt Clarice. Moreover, when Drew was a 20-year-old college student, he could have replied with cheerful negatives to sperm bank inquiries about the incidence of cancer, heart disease, and mental illness among his close relatives, since these had yet to fully reveal themselves. Had I decided at 20 to sell a few nice, fresh eggs, I could ignorantly but honestly have advertised these too as grade A, genetically. So okay, the control implied by a sperm and egg catalog is an illusion. Reproductive science may reveal all eventually, but for the time being, every baby comes as the small, mysterious bearer of the genes of vanished eons. The more interesting question is why, given this illusion, would seekers of donor sperm or eggs, or sometimes both, choose what they choose? The qualities my companion on the flight to Mobile openly declared herself to be seeking in a biodad weren't her own. Though she was white, she wasn't tall, for instance, nor an Ivy Leaguer, I asked. But more to the point, they are not the qualities the bumper stickers on her car would suggest that she held most dear. No, I didn't see her car. I didn't need to. I could look at the bumper stickers on my car and draw what I'm sure were the right conclusions. Peace, diversity, sharing and caring, the brother and sisterhood of all humankind, and love is all you need. I would have fallen into baffled silence if my companion on the airplane had announced she was in search of a spouse, but was only interested in upper-class Caucasian supermodels. On the other hand, all other things being equal, I'd just as soon the grandchild for whom I'd been knitting that booty was born handsome, healthy, and smart, if only to spare him the difficulties inherent in being homely, sick, and thick. So aren't I also hoping that when the genetic cards are dealt, my grandson will receive a winning hand, or at least the best the deck has to offer? Not my bunions and tendency toward melancholia, that is, but maybe his uncle's indefatigable good cheer, or his grandfather's open-mindedness and nice straight teeth. When my daughter Wooly was about 3, Drew and I began actively considering the adoption of a 5th child. I called a nonprofit adoption agency one day and I spoke to a woman about the process. My husband and I would like to maintain the present birth order in our family, I explained apologetically, which means we could really only consider adopting an infant under the age of 3. Is that possible? Well, before we got to that, Drew and I would need to be evaluated and educated as adoptive parents, which was, she said, a fairly lengthy process that could take up to 6 months to complete. Once we passed muster, there were 3 adoption programs we could choose between. First, we've got what we call healthy white infant. Well, we have 4 children already, I said, so we feel we've done the healthy white infant thing pretty thoroughly. What else have you got? Well, there's overseas adoption. Aren't there other American babies who need a family? I asked. Well, there is the 3rd program, she said, special needs. Really? But what about healthy non-white babies? They're in special needs. You're kidding. You mean an essentially healthy newborn African-American infant? Special needs. Well, put us down for that program then, I said, because that's what we want. African-American newborns are among the easiest babies to locate or adopt, she said brightly. Once you've passed your home inspection and completed the training, we could probably have an infant for you within 3 months. In fact, we have a little boy up for adoption who was just born yesterday in Jacksonville, Florida. Is the poor little guy going to have to wait 3 months? I said. Oh no, you've misunderstood. The average wait is relatively short for special needs kids because the demand is low. In fact, the chances are quite good that this little boy won't be adopted at all. For God's sake, I squeaked. Send him up here, we'll take him. The agency woman laughed. She thought I was kidding. Not long after this conversation, Drew died, and even I could grasp that this meant the end of the adoption idea. But to this day, I think about that little boy down in Florida, hoping some lucky family found and adopted him, and that he is well and waxing strong in spirit. Being adopted by itself is statistically correlated with vulnerability to various difficulties, health and otherwise, and while these are neither inevitable nor insurmountable, one might as well acknowledge the risks and be prepared to address them. This particular little boy, I call him Jacksonville in my mind, would, like any child, have his own distinctive and therefore special, in the more general sense, requirements. Perhaps he'd take a little longer potty training, or have to carry around an EpiPen in case of bee stings. Maybe as he grew, Jacksonville would demonstrate unusual precocity in mathematics and have a special need for extra tutoring to keep him from getting bored in school. I'm not naive. I know that being an African American child in a Caucasian family would present its own peculiar challenges, though my brother had already adopted my African American nephew, so little Jacksonville would have had at least one black cousin. And there would have been at least a few African American kids in his main schools, all of them the adopted children of Caucasians. I don't know if that would have been reassuring, misleading, or just weird. But a white friend of mine took his daughter to New York City, hoping to expose her to a wider range of cultures and experiences, and standing in the middle of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, his little girl gazed wide-eyed at the teeming, multi-ethnic multitudes. "Oh, Daddy," she exclaimed, "look at all the adopted people." So it might have been extra important for little Jacksonville to visit New York and Washington, D.C. and hang around our old friends whose whole families are African American. And maybe being the adopted child of our family wouldn't have been the best imaginable situation for little Jacksonville. But adoption, by definition, takes place because the alternatives are believed to be worse or aren't available. I might not have been a perfect adoptive mother for Jacksonville any more than I have been the perfect biological mother for my biological kids, or the perfect stepmother to my stepchildren. But I would have done my best for him. So there's another if only to add to the list of good things that might have been if only my first husband hadn't died. Always scheduled for the week of May 16th, Police Week is an annual gathering in which tens of thousands of law enforcement widows like me and orphans and law enforcement officers from the United States and abroad arrive in the nation's capital to participate in solemn ceremonies honoring the fallen. The families and friends of officers who have died are there to find and trace the engraved names of their loved one on the polished granite of the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial at Judiciary Square. I first went to Police Week as a widow in 1997. A decade later, I was invited as a chaplain to give the invocation at the annual Candlelight Vigil. And this time, two game wardens, Jason Luce and Josh Smith, were with me as moral support and arm candy. Jason is, like his chaplain, a history buff, happy to discuss the causes, conduct, and moral salience of the Civil War or World War II for hours. So he and I had entertained each other in this way on the long drive from Maine to Washington, all the way, 12 hours, while Josh dozed peacefully in the back seat. Our appetites whetted, and with Josh in tow, we went to Arlington National Cemetery and the monuments and the National Holocaust Museum in between the scheduled law enforcement events. All these sites were thronged with law enforcement officers, all recognizable even in mufti by their clipped hair and their ingrained habit of keeping their arms akimbo to accommodate a phantom gun belt. So I was in the company of cops that I visited my father's grave at Arlington, that I stood between the statue of Lincoln and the steps on which Martin Luther King Jr. described the dream, and watched a film at the Holocaust Museum that made me cry. In this film, two young soldiers ride a motorcycle along a street. The street is in one of the ghettos created by the Nazis to confine and starve thousands prior to their eventual deportation and murder. Like so much of the photographic evidence we have of Nazi atrocities, this film was shot by German troops, presumably to show to friends and relatives back home. So as their motorcycle comes toward the camera, the two young men grin and wave. Over to one side, crouched in a doorway, are a small boy and girl. They are scrawny and hollow-eyed, and the little boy is having a seizure in his sister's arms. The film is no more than a minute in length, and it is shown in continuous loop on a permanent screen, so the wardens and I could watch it again and again. Again and again, the two young men, healthy and smiling, ride toward the camera, again and again past the little kids in the doorway. The first time I watched, my focus was on the children suffering. Those could be my babies. Then I looked at the handsome young men on the motorcycle and realized those could be my babies too. I can't claim to be serenely immune to the kind of fear that prompts all of us to seek assurance and safety, or the illusion of it, amid the existential uncertainty of our own and our children's lives. All actual or potential parents have known this fear and sought to quell it through prayers to God, or deals with the devil, or even by those attempts at good breeding that long predated high-tech reproductive technologies that some might think of as informal eugenics. Parents try to immunize their kids against mediocrity with baby Einstein tapes, soccer clinics, and SAT prep courses. How odd it is that for all of us, not just the customers of sperm banks, the characteristics we try to inculcate are not those we are in the end most proud of. In the choices we make about and for our children, we are often encouraged to be Richard Dawkins-style Darwinists, seeking to maximize our children's ability to compete against their peers, socially, academically, athletically, ultimately financially. But as I stood with my brethren before that awful film, these advantages seemed completely beside the point. Dear beloved co-parent scene, our children are intelligent and healthy, and yours are even athletic. But have we adequately seen to the setting of each child's moral compass? Have we fostered the courage to heed it? How can I be absolutely sure that our children will not end up like those healthy, smiling boys on the motorcycle? The end. So I might mention that in the course of this book, and really the inspiration for writing it, or at least the trigger for writing it, was that my son, Zach, joined the Marine Corps. And he did this in 2004, which was when we had 2 wars going on, and neither of them were going well. And his service, his first discussion of this particular mode of service, and my resistance to the idea of him enacting it, and then eventually his joining up and going to boot camp and then going on from there, was both sort of an experience in itself, but it really became the lens by which both my husband and I really viewed the subsequent children, because there's 6 altogether, and he was the first, viewed how each of them came up and crossed the threshold into adulthood. It changed how we saw that transition. Because joining the Marines is very different from going to college. And it's very different from the parent's perspective. When you drop a kid off at college, which I've done a few times now, you load up the station wagon, you take them down to the dorm. The dorm room is always on like the 50th floor. So you help them lug all the crates up the stairs of all the books that for some reason they had to bring and all their whatever. And then you get back in the car after weeping and embracing, and by the time you're on the interstate, you got a call from them saying, "I forgot my shampoo. Can you come back?" This is not what happens when your kid joins the Marines. The recruiter actually picks him up in the driveway. Kid gets into the car and he is gone. Gone. You get one phone call in the middle of the night that they read off a card. "This is Recruit Griffith. I arrived safely at Marine training, blah, blah, blah. Paris Island." Click. And you're going, "I love you, honey." And then you don't hear from them again for weeks and weeks and weeks. And finally you get a letter, which in my case was, "Dear Mom,
Boot camp is fun, love Zach. Never had the workings of the adolescent male mind seemed more mysterious. But it has some of the other differences which actually began to reveal themselves over time, and by contrast, were things like, weirdly enough, when your kid goes to boot camp, and then there's advanced combat training, so they have kind of a whole year almost of training stuff. They're actually safer in many ways than your kid is when he goes to college, because there's no drinking and driving, no driving. No hookups, no date rape, no roofies, no bowls of gaily wrapped condoms in the student lounge, no, all of that, none of it. And no streaking. We went through that with one of the kids. They are kept working and exhausted continually for a year, which is really, for many young men, particularly young men, is an ideal state for them. Meanwhile, however, they have departed the house of mom, which is a developmental need, I think. And they've departed from it and entered into a world that, even though women obviously are there, it is nonetheless an extremely masculine, traditionally masculine environment. That they have left the world of mom and joined the world of warriors. And that's a really traditional, old, ancient, atavistic thing. So while my son was essentially incommunicado in the world of warriors, he was also earning his own money, had his own health insurance. And when something happened to him, for instance, when he developed cellulitis between his toes from running 12 miles in boots without changing his socks, they were actually considering amputating his toe. And they didn't call his mom. I found out about a week later. He's like, oh yeah, they were talking about taking off like half my foot, Mom. I'm like, they didn't call your mom? I gave birth to that toe. So he owns himself in a way that is at least one of the markers of adulthood. Is you own yourself and you are responsible for yourself to other adults. So there were elements of it, in other words, that despite my fairly strenuous resistance, because there were 2 wars on and I didn't want him to be killed or maimed or kill or maim other people, I mean, those are legitimate complaints, I think. There were elements of it that we were surprised to find that we liked and approved of and admired. So it was a very, it became sort of an interesting way that we saw that the transition from child to adult, particularly boy to man, because the first 3 of our kids are boys, so they all jumped over that threshold, or staggered over it, or tripped over it. For some, it may take a few decades. So anyway, that's what ended up being, I had to write my way to really a definition of an adult. So, though I like the title of this is growing on me. I actually wanted to call it 10-8 because the definition for me of an adult is you're 10-8, you're available for service. And Zach, our eldest, is available, he's 10-8. And each of the kids at some point crossed the threshold and became 10-8. And it was made really vivid when my youngest child, Wooly, became a police officer. And I heard her sign on 10-8. It was 402 on 10-8. And I went, oh, yeah. Her reaction was, at last I'm useful. So that's pretty much the thrust of the book. Are there any questions? Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about your reactions as a parent if you were to have a child, or just how you deal with people whose child develops a permanent health problem that you can't fix.
Well, fortunately, you mean as a chaplain or as a human being? as it happens, I have a child with a health problem that we can't fix, and it's serious. So basically, I would love to be able to have a really complicated, elaborate, and precise answer. The only answer I have is that so far, as I watch each of the kids cross into adulthood, what I am learning again and again is whatever it is they encounter, whatever they come up against, that love really is the foundation. That all of the love that we pour into our kids from when they're born, from before they're born, you know, all that stuff you do, that mindless, like, stuff we do with little babies, all of that is literally developing the capabilities and the strength in them to cope with, as best anyone can, with whatever it is that life throws at them. And one of the lessons that, one of the lessons I had to learn in terms of letting go, we talk about letting go of your children, right? They have to leave the nest, and is they're not safe. I mean, it was weird to realize my son is safer in the Marines, for the first year at least, than he was before that. But he wasn't safe. They're not safe. And accepting that, learning to live with that, because you've spent so much time trying to keep them safe, trying to keep them okay, trying to stand between them and the train. And to have to get out of the way and trust them to manage as well as anyone can, and hope that all the love you poured into them from your imperfect vessel is going to be enough. And so far, it's remarkably close to enough. Knock wood. There's no wood, so, yeah. Yeah.
So